going to bring our focus back to what's going on specifically in the sediments. And this is in the context of what's happening in relationship to sea level rise as well as to ecosystem restoration. A lot of what you saw in Ray and Lisa's talk this morning gives you the background I want, but there's a couple take-homes I want before I go through the next slides. And that is that the high rates of organic carbon productivity or organic carbon storage that we see in these marshes are driven by the high rates of productivity. And that occurs both above ground, and that's in the leaves, and also below ground in the roots and shoots. And both of those are really important, as I'm going to show you. And Lisa showed you this theoretical concept of where marsh accretion lies in terms of inundation or rate of sea level rise. And the point I want to make here is that there's really this sweet spot in terms of elevation where organic accretion is maximized. And this has important implications when we think about what a marsh's response is going to be to sea level rise. We have a really great natural site here in New England where sea level rise has been increasing and accelerating. And over the last several decades, we've seen a regime shift in species composition. We've seen these high marsh species really losing out and low marsh species, Spartina alterniflora, dominating. And that's really because the high marsh species have not been able to maintain their elevation or their accretion rate relative to the rate of sea level rise. And so what we've seen is the entire marsh platform has shifted from kind of this zone where high marsh vegetation is favored to this zone where low marsh vegetation is favored. And that's important because these two marsh zones have very different productivity. So instead of that one nice peak that we saw in the conceptual model, as a marsh moves out of this zone to this zone, it's going to have a different response rate, and it has a higher actual capacity to grow, because if you see down in this part of the slide, the brown numbers are the high marsh numbers and the green numbers are the low marsh numbers. The small bars are the above ground biomass, and the large bars are the below ground. And in each case, the high marsh is much less productive than the low marsh. And so this has important implications as we move through time, and this bar here represents about the 100-year scale for sea level rise in New England. So what we've done is we've looked at organic rich marshes, which are thought, organic rich with very low mineral supply, which are thought to be the most susceptible to sea level rise. And there's 4 marshes in Wacoit that we've looked at. We've dated 11 cores, and so we have 250 individual dated layers. And this is this zoomed in of the vegetation. So this is where the vegetation lies within its tidal frame. You can see high marsh here, low marsh here. And then we have dated layers or elevations of the marsh through time. And there's some things I want you to know. And the first one is that these triangles here, that's the high marsh. And the high marsh is pretty much on a trajectory of decreasing elevation. And so the high marsh is not able to keep up with sea level rise. Whereas here, the low marsh, you can see as the this site has really kind of touched on this peak in where the low marsh vegetation is dominant. It actually lost elevation for a little bit, but since about 1980, it's actually been able to gain elevation. And so what is happening is that we think that that higher productivity of the low marsh is actually able to sustain a greater response in terms of elevation from the marsh. And this is really important because, as Lisa touched on in her talk this morning, this accretion rate or this vertical growth is really what's controlling the magnitude of carbon burial. Carbon densities are largely constant with depth. And so if the marsh is able to grow faster, it'll be able to store carbon at a higher rate. And it's also important for resiliency. And so I'm going to switch and give you a very brief overview of what a restored marsh, and by restoration I mean when tidal flow has been restricted, which has happened a lot in times of infrastructure when you build right across a tidal channel. If you restore tidal flow to a marsh, what happens? And so what I'm showing very briefly here is natural marsh carbon accumulation rates. Orange is the restricted marsh carbon accumulation rates, and then gray is marshes that have had tidal flow restored. And you can see restricted marshes have a much lower rate of carbon sequestration, and natural rates are higher, and there's some lag and increase with tidal restoration. And then I'll just leave you with this last slide. If you extrapolate those rates over the past 100 years, there's about 100 tons per hectare of carbon that has been not buried in restricted sites compared to natural sites because of that lower rate of carbon accumulation. Thank you.